right. Hello, everybody. How is it going? Let's make sure that everything is live and up. I do see that we are up, but YouTube is currently saying that there are no viewers despite having several comments already. As it always goes. Okay, now we have some proper statistics. So, everyone, I would like you all to welcome Dr. James Tejani to the channel. This is Dr. James Tejani, who wrote a book that we will be discussing today. Ooh, let's make that. Oh, wrong size. There we go. Who wrote a book that we will be discussing today that also happened to have won the most prestigious award in the history profession, the Bancroft, which we will be discussing quite a bit. But also, he was my master's thesis advisor, so you guys might have seen plenty of the things I've talked about San Luis Obispo history. Well, he was very directly involved in a lot of that. And so we'll be talking a lot about that. But I also want to start off by stating that this is a fundraising stream, because all of the super chats and advertising revenue and all that will be going directly to helping survivors of the LA wildfires. You will notice that for those who are on YouTube, will notice that there is a link below, right below chat, that says the California Conservation Fund, I believe is what it's called. And you can donate directly there, but also all super chats and ad revenue will be going towards that as well, though it won't be counted until after the stream. But for those who donate the most to that, you'll have to contact me afterwards, but you guys will receive a free copy of this. We have 2 free copies of this book to give out to those who donate the most towards helping people who survived the wildfires just recently. I know James has plenty of folks who were affected. We actually have mutual friends who were affected, it seems appropriate because this book is ultimately about LA Harbor. So before we get started, a little bit about what the Bancroft is and why this book did so well, and then we'll rip right into questions that I have set up. So the book ultimately is, as it says on page 3, explains how people and events transformed San Pedro Bay, which is the bay where that LA Harbor is now today, but it was not a harbor at first. And by the start of the 20th century, became from an estuary into the nation's global gateway. The process culminated in the construction of the Port of Los Angeles. This is a story of the United States' formative yet troubled expansion to the Pacific, of its relationship to an envisioned ocean world, and of Americans' attempts to master this world, a story that led early on to San Pedro Bay and continues still. So it is a very strange and convoluted story that this unlikely location did not seem like a good place to put a harbor. There's better harbor places in California alone. There's San Diego and San Francisco. And yet the premier port for all of the United States today is Los Angeles. So the first question I want to ask, let's make sure that I got about 40 viewers in here by now, so we can start ripping into questions. It takes, for those who are viewing this afterwards or just coming in, there's always the possibility of watching it after it's fully done. So The first question I have for you, James, is why San Pedro rather than San Francisco and San Diego? Like, why was this such an unlikely locale?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. And initially, um, my very first idea was to study San Francisco because it was so obviously better suited. And for that reason, particularly in the mid 19th century, that's where US expansionists were very focused on San Francisco Harbor. There's even offers to Mexico in the 1830s from the Jackson administration to buy just San Francisco Bay. But the project started to change for one reason. It's just kind of where the sources led me. They led me away from San Francisco, but it was really the contemporary that drew me to the port of Los Angeles, because it's unrivaled in its importance as a commercial port today. As you said, it's called America's port. It's what it calls itself, and it's very much true in terms of the numbers, in terms of the revenue tons that flow through it, the amount of money that it generates, the connection to the number of 1.3 million U.S. jobs. And so in many ways, it is really a symbol of U.S. prominence and power in the world. The global system that the United States championed after World War II, that's the foundation of our current world order and disorder to some extent as well. And the Port of Los Angeles is really a cornerstone of that system. So it's a symbol of power. It's also a symbol of, I think, dependence, U.S. dependence on the international world right now. And this is really the flip side of the growth of that global system. Inbound trade has become such a determinant of the American way of life. It makes available so much of what we use on a daily basis. And our material reality really would be entirely different without it, certainly less comfortable. And so the Port of Los Angeles, because it's the entry point for so many of those imported goods, I wanted to study it for that reason. And the third importance of the Port of Los Angeles, I think it's really a symbol of the transformation of U.S. society, its economy, and its politics that we're still experiencing, we're still a part of, really since the 70s and the 80s. The loss of manufacturing jobs, the rise of global competition, the slowing and reversal of income growth for many Americans, changing geopolitics, and even the current reaction against free trade, even immigration. And I think the turn towards a really tech and knowledge-based economy, all of those things have shaped the United States. And global trade is really, the global system is really the mechanism for that. And the Port of Los Angeles, like you said, is the prominent entry point for that global system, and where the US and the world, that rubber meets the road. But to go back to the other part of your question, the unlikelihood of San Pedro Bay, you're absolutely right. This was quite an unlikely location to become so important as it is today. San Diego and San Francisco are the only fully protected natural harbors on the U.S. West Coast, other than Puget Sound. And that needs an explanation. We need an explanation for why this place that was not so endowed by nature is going to leap ahead. Sometimes that's told as a story about railroads, particularly like LA surpassing San Diego. That's told as a railroad story in the 1870s and 1880s. Mm-hmm. But what I found in my research is I found that LA was really set on that path a number of decades earlier. And this is what my first chapters in the book lay out, really in the first years after U.S. conquest, after the U.S.-Mexico War. It's going to be two federal government scientific projects that are trying to reckon with the challenge of having a transcontinental republic. one to map the coast, the other to chart a transcontinental route for a railroad. That's what's going to set LA on this path. And it happens at a time when LA is almost insignificant. It's like 2,000 residents.
It's just a little pueblo in the corner of a valley.
Exactly. So my book is really a story of how San Pedro Bay becomes less unlikely. And it's really a story of how Americans take charge of nature and distance and overcome those limits.
Yeah. And so, you highlight where you begin with those surveys, especially it's the first survey starts in 1849. And you really start the story right about then. Well, kind of with the actual conquest and then into that. So the next question I have for you is, why start with American conquest? Obviously you could talk about San Pedro Bay as how it functioned within the Spanish and Mexican colonial systems, and how it served in all the various civil wars that happened in California during the Mexican period. But instead you start there, and then you end basically with the dredging of the bay rather than anything that's happened since. In fact, it ends rather abruptly. And so why pick that framing?
Yeah, many readers have that question, as I've seen from the comments on the book online. My interest was really in the United States relationship with the Pacific, its engagement with the Pacific Ocean, and the U.S.-Mexico War and U.S. conquest. That's really the moment where the nation becomes contiguous with the Pacific Ocean. Even though Americans had entered the Pacific before, it was a faraway place. Maybe 8 months to get into the Pacific, let alone get to a place like Hawaii or China. But the U.S.-Mexico War is the moment where the United States and the Pacific Ocean become neighbors. And the U.S. becomes a republic from sea to shining sea. And so it's the point at which the American territory on the Pacific begins to profoundly shape the nation's development, or at least that's how I argue it. And the question of what to do with the territory begins to drive U.S. political contests. For example, the question of whether slavery is going to spread into the Southwest and beyond. During the Civil War, the question of whether secessionists or unionists will control the Southwest or Southern California. And even after the war, if you continue it, this question of whether railroad corporations are going to dominate the region. So all of those political contests really, they need U.S. conquest to happen. And that's really what I was after. And I think what those contests begin to show us that really is distinctive from the Spanish relationship to the Pacific or Mexico's relation to the Pacific is that the U.S. relationship with the Pacific Ocean from the get-go is one of paradox. It's one of great opportunity, but it also creates incredible troubles for the nation that are going to peak in the Civil War as the nation rips apart, and they continue still to this day as we really reckon with what Pacific trade means and what it does and how we should relate to it as consumers. So the point really was that this paradox has long roots, that it's a legacy of American expansion between 1846 and 1848, that moment of conquest. So starting with conquest was the best way to tell that specific story. And so you can tell already that this didn't set out to really be a comprehensive history of the Port of Los Angeles, so much as a history of how the Port of Los Angeles and its development fit in that paradox. So conquest and its legacy help us to understand that. But again, I think I should bring it back to your first question, which is really.
I do want to interject right
please
here
go ahead.
to thank they were anonymous donations, but we've already had two people, or maybe one person, anonymously donate a total of $200 to the CCF. So thank you for whomever did that. That's incredible. You're helping a lot of people out there. Also, I wanted to say I just realized that I did not actually say the name of the book and where to find it. I'm sorry about that. It's called oh, here we go. A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth: The Making of the Port of Los Angeles and America. You can find it linked below, and the full title linked below in the description. Sorry, I had to fix my mistake there.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, going back to like how you ended the book.
Yeah. So on the question of ending the book with the dredging, if conquest is the starting point, the estuary is really where the story of conquest comes to focus, because that's what happens to the estuary. I think is really the most important legacy of the story of conquest. And so to make that point, we should return to your first question, which is really about the nature of San Pedro Bay and how it wasn't a natural harbor. So for your viewers and listeners who are not familiar, San Pedro Bay is really best described as a bend in the coastline, but it had a sizable coastal estuary, 3,400 acres of estuary mud and marshland that ran dry for most of the day when the tide went out. And the estuary becomes the key to the story because it was really considered to be land, not water. So in many ways, it really underscores San Pedro Bay's natural disadvantages. And through California's Spanish and Mexican eras, and through the initial years of United States rule, the estuary is part of a land grant. It's land.
I believe this should help a little bit. This picture right here is, you can see Los Angeles in the background, everybody. And this is, I'd be guessing around, well, this is with the dredging already beginning and everything. So this is right at this is like, oh, it says 1900 plan. Okay, so this is what they were planning on building in 1900. Didn't really happen until like 1912, 1913. But you can see how distant Los Angeles is to that. And so most people will be familiar where Los Angeles is and kind of where the port is, but you can see how weird of a concept this place was at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of your viewers might be familiar with the famous image of the map of Los Angeles city that the comedian John Mulaney used in his stand-up for Netflix a year or two ago, with a thin strip going down to the harbor area. And Mulaney, I think, asked the audience, why do you think this exists? And gets a big laugh because of that, because it's obviously LA's grab for the harbor in 1909. But back to the question, the estuary is the key to the story. It's considered land. It's part of the Dominguez family's Rancho San Pedro land grant. And so what that means, thank you for pulling that up, is that before today's port could develop, somebody needed to establish the estuary as being water, as being navigable water, and establish a public claim that would displace the private claim of the Dominguez family. And so that happens in the 1850s as an outgrowth of conquest and these scientific surveys. It involves the Coast Survey. It's going to involve the Pacific Railroad surveys. And that's going to bring into the story Edward Ord, the future Civil War general. He's the one who is going to claim the estuary as navigable water and therefore as federal property and no longer part of the Dominguez estate. And Ord's going to do that specifically because of his ties to the War Department and the War Secretary Jefferson Davis. And so what that did is it made the book very much become about the estuary. And so the answer to the question of why and with the
map he created.
that is a map of the Rancho writ large, and then what you can see is the inset there. That little part is the part that Ord creates the Inner Bay exception in 1855. So he's just responsible for he surveys that. He's assigned to the Coast Survey, but it's actually part of a side hustle that he begins in Los Angeles as a surveyor for hire. So he's hired by Dominguez to map out the boundary of a subdivision Dominguez is interested in creating on the estuary. Ord takes the next step and creates a boundary around the entire estuary beyond the subdivision. So the subdivision is going to go to the buyers, and Dominguez he intends to do that sale. The estuary itself is going to go to the federal government, and from all evidence, Dominguez did not count on that happening. That's going to be Ord's doing, almost unilaterally. And so the estuary becomes the focus, and so its destruction really is the appropriate endpoint for the story.
So we'll be covering a lot about those dueling surveys, because it's not just dueling. There's like 4 separate ones at one point. But to move chronologically, the first people there are the Tongva, or Gabrielino-Tongva, and well, for a while in there, and as the book points out towards the end, there was this kind of myth that they had completely ceased to exist as a people, and there are now, I believe, 4 separate groups that are recognized by California, none of them federally recognized. But because of all of this history layered on, it's still ultimately their ancestral homelands. And do they maintain any kind of connection with the port today?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. It's a little bit more complicated. It depends on kind of what we mean by that and how we measure it. The descendants of the first people, the Tongva, and they, like you pointed out, they're kind of organized in bands. They have separate websites, slightly different names. My sense as an outside observer, and in the speaking to the one head of the San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Chief Anthony, my sense is that they certainly hold an ancestral spiritual connection to the Bay. No matter kind of where the various bands of Tongva descendants today orient themselves, or where they trace their ancestors to in the Los Angeles area, they all recognize that Tongva were expert mariners. They had seafaring canoes that
you called it woven wood, woven slats, which I'd never even heard that, even though obviously in Chumash they had the same thing, and very unique in that regard.
Yeah, very unique in terms of North American indigenous people, and much more similar to the Polynesians. And so I know some scholars have speculated on whether there was some kind of contact in the Eastern Pacific, and these designs got transferred. But they are seafaring in the offshore channel to the Channel Islands, and they're conducting trade between the islands all the way into the Mojave and even the Sonoran Desert. And so, they understand that there was this, the ocean and the bay formed a very central part of the Tongva world. And two of the most important surviving Tongva sites are fronting the bay, the island of Catalina, which the Tongva call Pimu, and then the Pavugna village site, which is on the Cal State University Long Beach campus, and still undeveloped as a remnant part of the campus. The challenge is that the sacred sites that would be at the Port of Los Angeles proper, they're buried beneath concrete and asphalt. And we know from historical sources, mostly mission records, that there were at least 6 Tongva villages at the time of Spanish contact in the general vicinity of the Port of Los Angeles on the shoreline or on the estuary line. None of them seem to have been very large. They were individually kind of smaller villages, but together as a cluster, they really indicate that this was a center of population and economy. And so one of the challenges is really going to be identifying exact locations, just because the development has been so thorough and the excavation machinery really disturbed and destroyed the archaeological record.
Something that you point out in the book is several times, like each chapter, each section is kind of like you begin with kind of like a what's the word for a vignette about like what's about to happen in terms of the story, but it comes back to like the ecology of the estuary at the end as like a vignette. But the last one, it has a lot to do with like how the dredging machinery kept on pulling up like middens, and that at the time they just kind of tossed it aside, but now when they're doing dredging, now there's like all this there was a expansion in the 70s, if I remember correctly, of that brought in a bunch of freeways and whatnot, and suddenly all of that had to be halted because of federal law requiring them to like work with the tribe and start to go through those middens.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this also at other estuaries in the Los Angeles and Orange County region, that there's burial grounds, there's artifacts. These were all the estuaries were important sites simply because of the biodiversity, the resources, the ease of fishing and gathering. And so no doubt the largest estuary, San Pedro estuary, hosted Tongva people, I think, in proportion. So I think all the descendants recognize that. If you flip to the other side, the official recognition of the Tongva claim, it's still in kind of an early formative stage. The city of Los Angeles and Los Angeles area towns have made quite an effort in recent years to acknowledge Indigenous claims, much like other communities around the country. And some of your viewers and listeners might remember the Oscar ceremony from a few weeks ago where they did a land acknowledgement. So that kind of thing happens.
I didn't hear about that. That's the first time they've ever done that, right?
I believe so, yeah. And so those kinds of statements are made at port events as well. But a formal recognition, formal commemoration within the Port District, I think that still has not happened. And it would be difficult to do to kind of pinpoint sites, but I'm hopeful that will change and is already changing. And I know there's interest for it from residents in the Port District.
And indeed, those villages then became fairly useful to the Mexican administration, who sought to forgetting the word for it, to secularize. There we go. To secularize the missions and basically convert all those neophytes into laborers or vaqueros, which brings us to the next question is the Dominguez family, who was granted the San Pedro land grant. Ultimately it was their land that would be sectioned out to create Wilmington and San Pedro. Some of their obviously there's no giant ranch there anymore. So what exactly happened to the Dominguez family? Do they still have a presence, or are they basically out of the picture?
This is, I think, one of the more interesting aspects of the story for people who are interested in the Hispanic Southwest and its history and its legacy. And I think it really complicates how we as historians think about that period and about conquest and settlement in California and the Southwest as well. You know, the Dominguez claim to lands at San Pedro Bay. It was I believe the first in the LA area, and it was one of the first ranchos to be given by the Spanish government in the 1780s, the mid 1780s. And it was massive. It was a massive amount of land. It was initially 75,000 acres. And that slowly breaks apart as the Spanish royal government had to reward other people. Dominguez, the original grantee, Juan Jose Dominguez, he was a prominent military officer, so he was given this land as a thank you. Then other officers had to be thanked as well. And so the 75,000 acres winnowed down. By the 1880s, it's about 24,000 acres.
Still that big in the 1880s?
Yeah.
Wow.
That tells you something. So that tells you that Manuel Dominguez was able to successfully navigate the period of conquest and hold on to a whole lot of land.
I was able to pull up the Diseño from 1843, if that'll help.
So at that point, I think it's about slightly more than 40,000 acres. And he has to share that with his siblings. So he's going to lose some of it that way.
And but to give viewers a bit of an understanding as to how gigantic this is the estuary. It's pointing north is pointing down in this. It's just sometimes that's how these diseños were made. 1843 would have been under Mitchell Terena, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. But you can see there's already like a claim to a port there, just a whole lot of land, which they managed to hold on to quite a bit of it. But
absolutely,
obviously that's not the case anymore. So
yeah.
What happened to that?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Manuel Dominguez, is that he really takes to U.S. conquest as an opportunity. In the book, I call him a prospector. He's looking to gain here, and he is quite shrewd. He's quite forward-looking, and he is going to protect most of the land that you saw there on the Diseño for his daughters. He had two sons, and the sons die by early adulthood. The last one, I think, in the 1860s. And so he has 6 daughters, and he's protecting the land for them. The daughters marry, and 2 of them are going to marry Anglos. And so Dominguez is very successful at bringing those Anglos in as advisors. And that initially was part of his relationship with Edward Ord, who was unmarried at the time. Dominguez was possibly feeling out Edward Ord to join the family, and Ord was, I think, flirting with that possibility as well. But the Dominguez daughters who marry and have children they established 3 lines through the Carson, the Watson, and the Delamo family names. And so those descendants are able to establish land companies around the turn of the 20th century. They manage petroleum rights and commercial properties. And so the ranch disappears, but the family, I think they wait to sell off land at opportune times, and they still continue to manage a lot of commercial real estate. And some of that was still undeveloped when I was a child, and there's very, very, very small segment of it that's undeveloped today. But if anyone, your viewers, if you drive through down the 405 through the area and the area of Carson, you'll see kind of some of these big commercial properties that they manage. So they do quite well, and they really adapt to a kind of real estate land development outlook.
And they continue to, and that wealth continues on down in the generations to today.
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. I had contact with one descendant, and I get the sense that the family, they come through all this quite successful. Now that's interesting because Edward Ord is going to use his relationship with Dominguez to grab the estuary, right? The 1,200 acres of what he claims is navigable. So Dominguez is going to lose that, and he's going to suffer at a disadvantage by conquest in that view. But it's exactly because the port's developed that the rest of the Dominguez family land becomes so insanely valuable in the 20th century and can be developed. And so, the family, I think they're very exceptional in that they navigate conquest quite successfully. In 2005, Manuel Dominguez was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City, and that says it all. He's not a victim of Western U.S. history. He helps write that history in some very important ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, what happened to the Dominguez family is not like it shows the complexity of we often, especially like in California, you get California history in the 4th grade, so it's extremely simplified, but it's normally taught that basically all the Californios were lied, cheated, and swindled out of their land. And this is a very clear example of people they lost land because of the surveys and that, and we'll get to that in just a second. But they managed to hold on to something that remains incredibly valuable to this day. A lot of Californians, especially if you have multiple generations in California, always have this story of great. I mean, I'm definitely one of these people that my great great grandpa had all this land, and then none of that wealth came down to me. He had a bunch of land in Orange, and but here they managed to be smart about how to maintain it, how to divide it, and how to proliferate it. But sometimes they did not have a choice in the matter, and that's when we come to our next question, which is why were so many of these different surveys, they were competing. You had the Coast Survey, you had the Railroad Survey, you had the initial survey in 1849. I forgot what that's called. And the various people administering this were kind of often at odds, especially when it came to the Pacific. Not the Railroad Survey, where you have these big sectional challenges where you have literally Jefferson Davis just choosing the outcome, and then people like Ord, who are just kind of navigating how to get more land for the United States, and him kind of choosing whether or not he's going to actually get that long distance survey for all the way across to Catalina Island and that. And so what was the difference between these? Why is the various levels of like publicity and dealing with the public interaction of these 1850s surveys matter so much?
Yeah, I found this to be a really interesting, eye-opening story for me as I was researching it, because we use terms like U.S. conquest, U.S. imperialism. These words have really become common ways of speaking about American history. Settler colonialism is another one that has really become quite common lately.
Yeah, it's controversial, but I use it a bunch in my diss.
Yeah, but what I found as I got into the surveying side of the story and these federal agencies that are sent out to do the surveying is that you really see that, yes, there's U.S. conquest. Yes, it's changing kind of balances of power in these local communities like Los Angeles in the late 19th century. But, it's like a herd of horses or buffalo. It's just like so many things are happening. They're at cross purposes. They're going in all kinds of directions. And so it really defies a hegemonic term like U.S. Expansion. When we look at what that really means, it's a very chaotic, sometimes contradictory process. And so these different survey agencies, they really illustrate that because they're after different things. They're managed by different parts of the federal government. They're competing for budget and for, I think, a kind of primacy to determine what happens in the West. Their staff have ulterior motives at times. So, I would say the main difference lies really in how the various survey agencies, these federal agencies, which would be the United States Coast Survey, the United States Army Engineers, which is actually two different groups, and the U.S. Land Office, the General Land Office, how those agencies, as well as the individual people within them, see themselves in relation to politics and real estate speculation with this land they see as being available and opening up in the West with conquest and Native American removal. So, just to give some substance to that statement, the Coast Survey, at least its career members, they're first and foremost scientists. And so the advance of science, scientific knowledge, research, and even public safety in shipping, that's their overriding objective. Their payoff is to create like the most accurate maps over the greatest distance. And that's such difficult work. Before computers and satellites, everything has to be done by mathematics and astronomy. But doing that, the innovation entailed, that was achievement enough. That could earn you an international reputation. That could make your career for the rest of your life. It could make you an academic at a college. And so the Coast Survey, that's really that's their interest. And, investing in land or profiteering is such a limited payoff to them. So someone like George Davidson is a great example. He really shuns money. For him, it's love over gold. He loves science. That's where he goes. And I think the other thing, the political side, is the Coast Survey. They do have to please Congress to maintain their funding, but the Coast Survey's leader, he really handles that. And it's Benjamin Franklin's great grandson, Alexander Dallas Bache. And he's just so well respected and connected in Washington that he has his way, in large part. There's moments in the book where politicians try and do get the better of him, including his friend and ally, Secretary Jefferson Davis.
I was really surprised by like the number of times he managed to basically outmaneuver like the entire Congress. And there's that time where Davis is like literally running to his office trying to get people are assailing Jefferson Davis's office trying to get like prompts on the railroad survey and everything before it's actually done. And Bache is like this he's from New England if I remember correctly, but is he Massachusetts or is it Connecticut? I can't remember which.
The Franklin family goes back to Massachusetts. He grows up in Philadelphia, though.
Oh, okay. Always Franklin, right? So that's not New England. That's the middle colonies. But he is very much anti-slavery, even though very insinuated with people like Jefferson Davis. But it seems like he's really trying to, especially at parts, trying to prevent the Civil War. Like he seems to really be genuinely trying to keep the sides together and like maneuver around to keep these surveys active. And it's just this really fascinating, complex story. And that kind of brings us to one of the, I think it's specifically about Bache, if I remember correctly. These surveys end up playing a huge role in the oncoming Civil War, which LA the decision over where LA will have a harbor ends up playing a role in that. And you say here on page 175, the transcontinental map shattered because of those who dared to create it. And referring specifically that shattering is the Civil War itself. So how did these random surveys end up playing such a huge role in the Civil War? Or at least its causes.
Yeah, so that passage it really refers to this idea that the more the United States government and society, the more they know the West, the more they know about it, the more they open it to settlement, the more this becomes a political fight over who will get the benefits of controlling the West, developing it, getting its resources, getting the gold that's flowing out of California. And so it's this really interesting moment where the more the United States gets what it wants in the region, the more the country is destabilized by that, by getting what they want. The more they try to stabilize, the more they make the effort to stabilize, the more they upset and destabilize the country. And so, I think there's really several ways that the book is going to connect to the war, the lead up to the war and its legacies. And the most important are the political contest. So, that is going to polarize and ultimately break the nation. That great game to control the West. The issue of slavery, of course, is part of that, where slavery will be able to spread or if it will be able to spread in the West. But I really saw it as an imperial story, an imperial contest between North and South to control the West. And that plays out in these surveys. And particularly, like you said, nowhere more clearly than where to place the Transcontinental Railroad. San Pedro's estuary also shapes the war as the Union government during the war begins to use it as a supply harbor to defend Southern California first, which very much teetered on secession. Yeah. And then the desert interior all the way to where you are, to the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And Phineas Banning, the estuary developer, the Wilmington developer, his clutch moment is really when he's able to convince the Army to use his facilities at the estuary as a base of operation for that military buildup to defend the Southwest. But the U.S. troops that end up coming during the war, entering at the estuary and receiving supplies through San Pedro Bay, they don't end up fighting Confederates. They mostly fight Native Americans, the Apache, the Navajo, other desert peoples. And so that becomes part of the Civil War story as well, the story of Indian subjugation, which is going to open kind of the desert interior, and that's going to propel the rise of Los Angeles further, which in turn propels the need for a harbor further. So that circle begins to close. And then finally, many of the characters of the book go on to take significant roles in the Civil War as it's fought in the East. So Edward Ord, Jefferson Davis, George Davidson, and Bache are part of it. And even the future LA Public Works Commissioner, the guy who's going to oversee the early construction of the port, along with the LA Aqueduct, a man named Adna Chaffee. He's a cavalry trooper in the war, and he's actually wounded in the Gettysburg campaign. So the Port of Los Angeles touches all over the Civil War and Civil War people in all kinds of ways.
And one of those people who really come to define San Pedro Bay during this, is person who ends up defining a lot of the rest of this story, which is Phineas Banning, who comes in as basically a booster for the region, and helping found Wilmington and all that, which is the main place for shipping everything. And he manages to outmaneuver the army in terms of contracts, because you have people like Bache who are just like, that's a stupid idea. Why are you trying to send ships there? Send it into like San Diego and then across, rather than to LA and then up the Cajon. There were different transport routes that could have been chosen, but Phineas Banning manages to get them all really focused on LA. So how did he manage to do that? And was he one of the greatest hucksters of the 19th century?
Yeah. I love that question. Banning, he really inherits the effects of Ord's survey, Ord's taking of that estuary for the federal government, and then Banning's going to run with it. And he is one of the great hucksters because of the fact that he promotes the estuary as a harbor against very long odds. And so it's really to his credit that this place that becomes so central to the United States and the world economy, it becomes significant, because of him. And that should earn him a spot on that list of hypesters and salesmen. He's able to sell this location, this very unlikely natural location, to investors, to LA taxpayers, like you said, the U.S. Army, later to railroad corporations like the Southern Pacific, and against these critics, many of whom are in dissident parts of the federal government. He also does it, against rival commercial interests in places like San Francisco and San Diego, who are incredibly powerful. So outmaneuvering them is quite a skill. And I think he does belong in the company of that age of unregulated American capitalism and confidence men. The society was rife with these kinds of people. I would add, just to Banning's credit, is that what's really interesting, I think, about him is that he's much less of a swindler because he's actually proven correct.
Well, only by sheer willpower, though. Sure. I love that story where it's where the first big shipment goes out of the bay, and he has to basically unload everything from it to make it get past the sandbar.
Yeah, empty boxes.
Yeah, but everybody's fooled by it.
Yep.
But it really took that kind of willpower to do it. And then in terms of the Southwest as a whole, he becomes this major freighting company that feeds all of these forts. And you know, the a lot of these forts were not in good places for, like, logistically. They just happened to be where the army plopped them down, especially Carleton, and with his whole California column, just kind of plopped a bunch of forts down on his way way east to here. He actually made his base just in Old Town from here. And how did Banning manage to keep so many of these forts supplied despite the obvious logistical problems?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting aspect of the Civil War era army is there's such a rush to get troops into the field and supply them that the military contracting system, it really begins to dictate what is possible. It begins to, depending on the area, they get to dictate prices. There's some competition. In some places in the West, there's very little competition, especially in Southern California, because like I said a couple minutes ago, LA is such a hotbed of secession that you really have very few loyal unionists to choose from. Banning is one of them. And so he's your freight guy, and you're going to be dependent on where he says the wagons can go, where things are possible. And so I think that begins to dictate the military's footprint. A fort may not be placed in the optimal place, the optimal location for the troops, or for a strategic position. It might have to be placed in the optimal position for the wagons to get to it, at least until you have time to later on build a road, or grade a hillside or a canyon or something like that. And so I think very much Banning, Carleton's responding to this, but Banning is essentially saying what is possible. A military runs, it runs on its boots, it runs on its stomachs, and these contractors, they really developed an outsized influence, maybe in ways that are comparable somewhat today. I don't know that issue so well, but we hear about it from time to time. The military contracting economy can develop these kind of adverse interests pretty easily. And I think that's especially true back then, when there was so little oversight and so much duress in the national emergency.
Oh yeah. I mean, like, it's also fascinating how much of this, where it's like, there's here in New Mexico, there's that famous Battle of Valverde, which happened right next to a fort and I've been out there, like, tramping around in the desert, and like the Fort Craig, which is on a bend on the Rio Grande, and it was literally so that they could have that access to water and be near the Butterfield stage line. That they could have possibly marched out and captured the Confederate camp while they were camped up on the bluff there. It would be a bit of a steep climb, but they could do it. But the problem was they didn't have the supplies that were supposed to be coming from Los Angeles at the time, but because of everything happening in 1861, they couldn't. So it's like a direct effect that Valverde was ultimately a Confederate victory, though rather brave fighting from famous frontiersman. Can't remember his name, but these kinds of things actually ended up directing much of the war effort itself. I mean, the reason why the Confederates had to leave was because their wagons got burnt up in the pass north of here. These are things that are dictated by the logistics and everything, but the logistics end up being a lot of personality, which is what Phineas Banning does. And through all that, he manages to get a lot of control over the bay, especially in terms of like who can buy up land titles and all of that. Now, before I move on to that question, I want to point out for those who have come in and didn't see the beginning of this, once again, wrong one. We are talking about this book. James's book, A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth. It is linked below, but also this is a fundraiser, so we haven't actually had any super chats yet. And said at the beginning, those who have the most super chats, all of that will go to victims of the wildfires in LA, since we're talking about LA Harbor. So as a reminder, I wanted to point out that folks can do that. People filter in and out during a live stream, and sometimes they'll come in later because they didn't know when to go. But with that being said, Banning had a lot of control over who would be granted what, especially through the Dominguez family and whatnot, which ended up having a lot of weird competing claims over tidelands and just all over the estuary that makes up LA Harbor today. And in trying to make that over the next from the 1870s all the way until well, the big case is 1890s, but for 20 years there, those claims end up gunking up the works in terms of creating a harbor, and that forms a good chunk of the next part of the next part of the book. So how did the courts, the Los Angeles, the various small stakeholders in that end up resolving those various claims to the estuary and tideland?
Yeah, good question. I think the simplest way to kind of lay it out is that the portion of the estuary that Ord claims as federal navigable waters, that today is the inner harbor of the Port of Los Angeles. It's the area kind of north of the Suspension Bridge. If your listeners and viewers want to look it up on,
I can pull up a picture if you describe, if I know what to search for.
Yeah, it's where the harbor kind of goes inland, and it kind of has two branches, a east basin and a west basin, north of Terminal Island. And that area, that estuary that's going to be developed into this inner harbor, it's decisive in the government's decision, the federal government's decision, to build the breakwater that's going to shelter the outer waters.
I can just pull up maps, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be on Google Maps. So the government's going to essentially lay a line of boulders in the outer waters to shelter. Yeah, you got it. So you can see there both the outer and inner harbor of the Port of Los Angeles. And
so this would be the outer?
Yep. And if you look real carefully, you can see kind of jutting from the peninsula, the start of the breakwater. It's a real thin line on the screen.
This little line right here?
Yep. And in the 1940s, they extended all the way to the edge of LA County, all the way through Long Beach, with a little small gaps in between.
Mm-hmm.
Long Beach there is my hometown. And so the estuary is going to be decisive in the federal government's decision to invest in that outer breakwater. Before that development can happen, however, the government and before the government can begin constructing the port, the private land claims, private property claims have to be evicted. And here's where the lack of navigable water, really the dubiousness of Ord's 1855 survey, has a very conflicted legacy. So private investors like Banning and Collis Huntington, they clearly saw the estuary as land, because by the 1870s, they're establishing land claims all over the estuary for nominal amounts of money. State and federal law incentivized this kind of giveaway of public resources. And as the transcontinental railroads build into Los Angeles, 1880s, 1890s, those estuary claims become really valuable real estate. It's waterfront real estate in a growing harbor. So two things are going to happen as a result of that. The first is that the Dominguez daughters, Manuel Dominguez is deceased at this point, they sue to try to get the estuary back. And that case, as you said, goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1890s. The 1897 decision sides against the family and basically eliminates their private claim. And in the process, it legitimizes Ord's survey for the first time in history, in law. What happens next is that raises the question of the other forms of private property, whether those are legal inside the estuary. So Banning's claim, the railroad's various claims. So those become the tideland claims. And the two areas of government are going to deal with that and deal with it slightly differently. So the first part is the Army engineers, the Army Corps. They're going to use dredging effectively to eliminate the claims by in the areas where the federal government has jurisdiction, simply by transforming mud and marsh into water, just wiping out the land. And so they already have the jurisdiction to do that. And there's a little bit of a fight where the land claimants, they try to shape kind of where the Army engineers will do this and not do this. The Army engineers end up winning pretty effectively in that contest. So that's the federal area of jurisdiction. There's an additional area of government jurisdiction, and that's the state shoreline, the actual area where the tide is moving up and down during the day. And Los Angeles, when it merges with those bayfront cities of Wilmington and San Pedro, it takes over that claim to that land. The state gives it to Los Angeles. And then you get actual litigation in court over who owns those tideland claims. And Los Angeles is going to win most of those between 1911 and 1916. It's a very, they're battling railroad company lawyers, like the leading edge of modern legal profession comes from railroad corporations. And
you mentioned in the book at one point that the first ruling on the 14th Amendment comes from some of this litigation, which is I'm forgetting the name of no, it's not Mariposa, but Southern Pacific versus some
Santa Clara.
Huh?
Santa Clara?
Maybe.
The corporate personhood case?
Spanish, and they all blend together after a while. But that's the one that finally establishes legal personhood for corporations. Yeah. Even though that arguably goes all the way back to Roman times, but that was the first time the 14th Amendment had ever actually been ruled on, and it's in favor of the Southern Pacific. Although one of the writers of the amendment was a lawyer for the railroad. Amazing how corrupt our system can be.
But you're right. That's the world. And so, whether the Army engineers can prevail, that's a question. That's an open question at the time. Same with the city of Los Angeles. You're taking on very powerful legal forces. And I think what's amazing is that both the city of LA and the Army Corps of Engineers
went out.
Yeah, they went out.
And that allows for a larger question when that ends up, you could still see it visibly today, which is Santa Monica and the pier there, which as all of this is going on, the Southern Pacific eventually just goes like, yeah, why don't we just build our own? And so it becomes this huge fight over, whether or not the People's Port will end up being the port for Los Angeles. And this has a whole lot of infighting within the Chamber of Commerce and all that kind of stuff. So can we learn something from that fight over the Freeport fight, and what happened to Santa Monica afterwards? It seems to be doing just fine. Oh, and we have a donation from Tom Trask. Thank you, Tom. And we have another anonymous one for making up a total of $30. So thanks, guys, for donating towards helping people in need in Los Angeles. It's we have friends that are down there, and it caused a lot of problems. So can we learn something from this People's Port fight? Is there something worth duplicating? Because they seem to want out.
Yeah, I hope so. I think there's a range of lessons in that episode. Some are partisan, meaning that they would appeal more to a person of certain political outlook today. But some of the lessons are really nonpartisan. And I think the People's Port fight, in essence, is a campaign, to rescue Southern California's economic prospects generally, and to rescue San Pedro's estuary specifically from private monopoly. And so it has those it happens in two stages. There's the kind of 1890s fight over San Pedro versus Santa Monica. And then there's the later stage is during the next decade. And it's really about control over waterfront access, both stages involving the Southern Pacific Railroad very prominently. But the idea is to rescue, shipping and commerce from private monopoly, and monopoly that would, I think, obstruct what people like the Chamber of Commerce and the Army engineers who are involved both see as a kind of obstructing competitive market-based development at the harbor. And that's really interesting for how it sets up the different sides, because, on one hand, it's a case, so just to take the Army engineers case, it's a case of military officers acting on principles that today we might see as libertarian, even conservative principles, because they believe they're promoting efficiency. They believe they're ushering in a technological future. And both of those things are watchwords that, are everywhere in the political news these days. And at the same time, the Army engineers, they explode kind of our political spectrum, because they're also engaged in a battle against the corporate sector, what they see as moneyed interests that they see as betraying the nation's interest, the public interest. And so at the same time as they're pursuing this kind of competitive, efficient, technological solution, they're also asserting a kind of technocracy and a muscular government power. They're also, I think, asserting scientific expertise, all things that we would associate with kind of big government arguments today. So, government knows best, or a kind of I believe in science ethos that we associate with liberal politics. So I think the People's Port, what's very good about it is that, like I said, it defies our political sensibilities of what's left, what's and right on a political spectrum. And it has a lesson, I think, for every reader. Either way, I think the most important part of the People's Port episode is the commitment to finding a patriotic moral high ground to solve a very difficult problem. People in the Chamber of Commerce or the Army Engineers or the City of LA, they really are able to think beyond their personal and partisan interests to seek what's good for the country or their fellow citizens. And so I'd ask readers, most of all, I think, to think of that motive. It's such a strong impulse for people growing up in the shadow of the Civil War. And I hope it's a motivation that we could recover some today.
Yeah, I always try to avoid using the whole left versus right dichotomy until the 20th century, because honestly, until the 20th century, it doesn't really make sense in American politics. You don't really have a left or right wing party or anything along those lines until basically progressivism. Here, what's really weird is we're still talking about elites, in terms of the Chamber of Commerce, who are fighting on behalf of having a city-owned port against, the Southern Pacific, who, all already paying off a lot of the Chamber of Commerce. You have Huntington and Stanford and, the big four, who are, well, two of them are already dead by this point, but they're asserting their will, and somehow these lesser, though still pretty much elites, these lesser elites manage to win out in terms of who owns the port and where it goes. So, if we're just talking about big interests versus smaller, and big business versus small business, somehow small business won. So what was the deciding factor there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I'd amend it a little bit to say that the small business wins and then is able to become the
big business.
Yeah, which is, I think, seems to always be true to some extent. But I think they, at least at the turn of the 20th century, there's really a sense of the state, of the public sector, to be a vehicle that can kind of, leap ahead and tame the wildest, most powerful components of the private sector. I think that's really part of the reform ethos, and it's part of changes in legal interpretation. So you brought up the 14th Amendment and corporate personhood, but the 14th Amendment is finally, in the early 20th century, going to start to get applied to people as well, and to citizens. And I think there's also a recognition of the development of public finance. It lags behind. The great innovator of the post-Civil War period is private finance. But finally, in the early 20th century, reformers begin to wake up to public finance as a way, I think, to keep pace and grow the public sector and its capabilities of, building infrastructure, regulating, markets, and taking over utilities and kinds of things that are, I think there's such an idealism around that 100 years ago that maybe isn't there today, but we need to look back at the history, I think, to understand why there was such idealism, and I think try to rekindle it to an extent that will work for us. Although deciding what works for us might be hard, but yeah, I think that's what really lies at the heart of that story, from my perspective.
Yeah, and I always like to point out, when we're talking about Gilded Age stuff, it's that wealth inequality was roughly at the same rate as it is today. We have higher wealth inequality than we have had since the 19th century. So perhaps we should look to the 19th century and early 20th century for ways to combat this wealth inequality. but there's one question I didn't actually send to you because I actually just came up with it last night. But I'm sure you'll be quite ready for this one, because it deals with that particular time frame and how this fight over the LA port had to do with international politics, and that's specifically with the growth of imperialism in the United States, especially international. We can argue about like whether it counts as imperialism for settler colonialism and all that. I'd say yes, but but more, the Spanish American War and the impetus to grow to build a port because of that. So what role did LA Harbor, the fight to build LA Harbor, play in this growing imperialism?
Yeah, I think this was an insight for me in research and writing the book, writing it, especially when I had to kind of piece it, to pick the pieces together. I think there is when LA expands and takes charge of San Pedro Bay and begins to prosecute the Tidelands cases and build its part of the port. It really asserts itself as the rightful heir to American expansion. And so I came very much to see Los Angeles and its rise as a modern city as being part of the imperial story, not just about claiming water from the Owens Valley or, attracting Okies and population in the mid 20th century. I think there's a concerted effort by Los Angeles to position itself as part of the United States emerging network of interest in the Pacific, to really become like a metropolitan center of that emerging American Pacific. And that, I think, is very, I have not seen that really developed in the historical literature so much today. But I think it also relates to the modern, to the present day, in that it helps us recognize that much of the global order that's emerging today is still being determined in this place. And so what happens in the Port of Los Angeles and what we do with it is it's going to shape the world we live in some very big ways.
Yeah, and the trying to position themselves as that, as like the port for going to the Philippines and Hawaii and all that, really helps push the fight to actually start building this thing. Because even by 1911, when you have the whole movement to have the Civil War reunion there in 1912, you describe it as a Los Angeles Civil War happening in the, all these scandals over how it's getting done, who's corrupt, who's not, and it doesn't really get started until even after the Civil War reunion in 1912. So the fight over San Pedro remained all the way until then. I mean, we started the story with 1850, and somehow by 1912, it's still not done. And so, I wanted to return to this larger story of, was San Pedro inevitable? And, the way that it still plays a huge role in, our consumer culture today, in terms of being the most used port in the United States, which is obviously the most powerful economy in the world. Did it create the LA economy, with LA being, the greater Los Angeles area actually covering more people than even New York. Going all the way down to Orange County and Riverside, because it's really just one big city. Like the Palisades, for instance, were not part of LA at first, but now they are. And once again, guys, still opportunity to send in some super chats and everything. And remember, we'll be giving away to anybody who does, the top two. In this book, we see this kind of going back and forth on whether or not to even build San Pedro into a port and everything. So was the harbor inevitable? And did it create the LA economy and consumer culture, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, good question. I should back you up just a little bit and add in the canal, the Panama Canal being built, right, is also creating a lot of dissension in LA when the port's stalling and not being built. I think, at a certain point in the book story, a harbor near Los Angeles becomes very likely. But even at that point, a major international port is not really inevitable, nor one built at San Pedro Bay. That story still, like you said in the lead up to your question, that has to be worked out through these kind of political contests, as different players are trying to shape the port as it's emerging. There's even this question of whether LA is capable of doing this, because it's doing so many public projects at once, the aqueduct being the other major one. And does it have the financial resources and can it get the investors' confidence to buy bonds to do this? So that all has to play out. I think, there would have been a port, there would have been a major harbor somewhere on the Southern California coast, at least by the point that Southern California's population starts to really boom, 1880s, 1890s. They need a harbor somewhere. But even as late as,
San Diego.
Yeah, that they could have gone back to San Diego for sure. Once they develop the technology to dredge and to build breakwaters, that really opens up other areas of the coastline, other estuaries that you could dredge out, and that do get dredged out, but they're small craft harbors, largely. A lot is, I think, around 1900, San Pedro is still one of many possibilities. It's Los Angeles's kind of miracle that the political establishment, the finances, the tax base, can all come together. World War I interrupts the construction of the Panama Canal. It gives LA a little bit of a respite to get its act together. And that really is what seals the deal, is once LA can really pull this off. And I think that's to its credit as a city, developing these municipal sectors and agencies. It kind of vaults ahead as very much a leading Western American city, able to build itself against the odds. So I think that's the point at which this is no longer a contingency, but LA's harbor is happening. It's the deal is done. And so that's why the story ends there. And it doesn't really go into the pouring of concrete, the building out of the harbor, which is still continuing to this day. It starts around 1915. There's good books about that already existed if viewers and listeners are interested. But I really wanted to end at that point where, like you said, this is inevitable, and LA's rise is inevitable as a global city.
Yeah, and so part of that question though is also, did it create the LA economy? Is it a did was San Pedro made because of the LA? Because all the way until 1912, it's not really being dredged yet, and still a fight over causing huge amounts of discord within the LA political establishment. Um, and right then we see in terms of LA history, that's when you start seeing the initial Hollywood boom. You see the rise of the aircraft industry. Um, Hollywood's still a big thing. Aircraft, kinda. You still have some aircraft companies, especially. I love Skunk Works is still there. The but those two things managed to propel them into just a meteoric rise throughout the 1920s and 30s, to the point that they're literally the fastest growing city, first in the United States and then for a little bit in the world.
Yeah.
And funny enough, the city that took their crown for being the fastest growing city was Albuquerque.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
From the 1940s to the 1960s, Albuquerque was the fastest growing city.
Wow.
Las Vegas ended up being that for a while too.
Sure.
But that boom could be argued to be predicated on this construction, or it could be the other way around, that the construction is predicated on the boom.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
That question's quite a brain teaser. I think, for understandable reasons, I, as the author of a book about San Pedro Bay, I would argue that San Pedro Bay makes Los Angeles for sure. And that's an interesting that you brought that up, because when I was shopping the book proposal to publishers, one of the publishers wrote back, interesting topic. Why not make this a history of Los Angeles? I didn't have the conversation with him, but my book agent did. And I told my book agent, I said, the port makes LA, right? What it is, it's not the other way around. But I think those are my cards. But I think the other side of your question really gets at something that is a quandary, a predicament of our world, the world we live in, a world of complex, massive, powerful institutions like the Port of Los Angeles, that makes us different than, say, the 19th century world in which the port story began. And that is, a place like the Port of Los Angeles, and the role it plays in our lives today. It really starts to confound our sense of cause and effect. It bewilders us when we think about cause and effect, because you end up in a situation where it's a fair question to ask, do we control it? Do we control the Port of Los Angeles, or does it control us? Ooh. And that's what I think is really fascinating about your question. And I think the answer is yes for both questions. It does both. And that's what I hope when, your listeners, when they leave this chat, readers, when they close the book, I hope that's something they'll think about. The Port of LA has this immense capacity to shape us, our country, our world. And that requires us, if we think about it that way, it requires us to figure out, well, what do we want from this? Because it's supposed to be a tool at our disposal. So what do we want our lives to be like? What do we want our country to be like? What do we want the world we live in to be like? And if we're dissatisfied with what we see, as so many Americans and I think people around the world seem slightly dissatisfied today, or a lot dissatisfied, then we need to go back to those questions to guide us, and go back to the history to give us the wisdom it has to offer.
Yeah. It's a great place to end this, and in fact, it's basically where you conclude the book. Which I wanted to read a quote from the second to last page on here. This is from page 375 if anybody's coming along. And remember, folks, that you can get the book. It's linked below in the description. And thus far, we've only had one super chat. So after this, what is the name? After this, Tom Trask get in contact with me. But the people who, this is page 375, the people who made a harbor of San Pedro and first grappled with its conditions, with its consequences are gone. But the machine they created remains. As a marvel of human invention, it obliterates distance to connect the pieces of our world. It defies scarcity to provide for our material needs, yet it entangles us in a system that obscures the capacity to see, think, or choose otherwise. The port, with all it represents, is scarcely a visible thing. And yet, you can learn a lot more about it in the book. So once again, I want to thank James for coming on, and also huge congratulations for winning the Bancroft Prize, the most prestigious award in the history profession for this book. So it will be linked below. Also, the fundraiser will continue for those who are coming on, and seeing this after it's been after the live viewing. You can still donate through that. It's all handled by YouTube and all that kind of stuff. And thanks for watching, everyone. Is there anything more you'd like to say about the book before we call it?
No, sir. Thank you to the audience for being here.
Yeah, we've had 844 views on the on thus far. So, though an average of 6 minutes view time, people filter in and out over time. Sure. But for the 60 or so of you who are still watching right now, thanks for watching, and it will of course be available afterwards. I should stop having the little banner there. And the for those on the YouTube side, the description has all the information you need in terms of going and finding the book, and right below the chat or below the screen is a donation thing for victims of the California wildfires. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's oh wow. Danny, be sure to contact me too. Danny Ferguson just donated. I thought that said I'm mixing up stuff. Somebody donated $150, but it was anonymous. But thank you guys for donating. That is incredible, and it helps people. There's a lot of victims of this. It's one of the most expensive natural disasters of all time. It's going to take a lot of rebuilding, and the Port of Los Angeles is going to play a key role in that. So be sure to check out the book, and thanks, James, for joining.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Yeah, thank you, and your channel. I love your channel.
Oh, thanks.
Happy to support it.
All right. Hold on. Well, there we go.